Night descended on the city like a heavy black blanket, dimming the street lights, shading the silhouettes of buildings in the thick fog. The cold air was saturated with the smell of wet asphalt mixed with the cinders of distant factories. The alley Ciara turned down seemed like a dark corridor between two worlds, the bustling avenue behind and the silent void ahead. Her footsteps sounded rumbling, too loud. She felt the back of her neck beaded with sticky sweat. Instincts, trained over the years, screamed, "Stop! Look back! Run!" But she only took a deep breath and clenched her fists. "Hey, you!" The voice broke the silence like a whip striking his skin, rough, tinged with arrogance. Ciara froze, not turning around. "I said stop!" Another voice. A second. The sound of heavy boots, gravel crushing beneath their soles. They were getting closer. She turned her head slowly and saw two policemen emerging from the shadows. One was tall, wiry, with a tired face hidden by the visor of his cap. The other was massive, with a broad chest and pale eyes that glowed like a hungry animal in the dark. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" His voice was icy. "Coming home. Alone? At a time like this? Is there a law against it?" The policemen looked at each other. The tall one shook his head, but the other, the massive one, stepped forward. "Documents." Ciara slowly pulled her ID out of her pocket. Her fingers were dry, but everything inside was trembling. She handed over the paper, watching as the massive policeman glanced at it lazily, then tossed it to the ground with a chuckle. "Pick it up." Silence. She didn't move. The policeman frowned. He stepped closer, so much so that his heavy odor sweat, leather, burnt coffee filled her lungs. "Didn't you hear me? I said, pick it up." Ciara looked him in the eye. "You can pick it up yourself." The massive policeman's cheeks flared. Irritation flashed in his eyes. "What did you say in there?" She didn't answer, just lifted her chin. "What do you think you are, you black bitch?" Suddenly he grabbed her arm. Ciara gasped as his fingers gripped her wrist like a vice. She tried to pull away, but the grip was steely. "I don't think you understand how things work around here. You're a nobody." The second policeman froze. A flicker of doubt flashed in his eyes, but he remained silent. "Let me go, officer." Her voice sounded calm, but there was a storm raging inside. The massive policeman smiled. "What are you going to do? You're going to complain? To whom?" He pushed her backward, causing her to stumble. She inhaled heavily. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" "So what?" "I don't care." Ciara swallowed convulsively. The anger was burning inside her, but she knew that if she let her emotions get the better of her now, it would only make things worse. "I'm leaving." She took a step back, but he was faster. The policeman's hand flew up, and the blow caught her before she realized what had happened. A sharp pain pierced her stomach, burning her from the inside out. She bent in half, gasping. The world froze. The pounding of heels on asphalt. Someone screaming in the distance. But all Ciara could hear were the beats of her own heart. She couldn't fall. She had no right to give up. Slowly, lifting her head heavily, she looked up at him. And in that moment, something changed. Pain exploded inside her, like a sharp blade piercing her stomach, tearing through tissue. The air left her lungs, and for a second the whole world dissolved into white noise. Ciara staggered, barely able to stay on her feet, grasping the cold brick facade of the building. "Bitch, what the fuck are you doing?" The massive policeman's voice was soaked with gloating. There was no regret in his eyes, only pleasure. The other cop standing next to him gulped, as if he wanted to say something but only looked away. He knew what the game was. He knew how these meetings ended, and he knew it was better to keep quiet. Kiara was breathing heavily. Her head was buzzing, the throbbing in her stomach echoing throughout her body. He'd hit her. The damn cop let himself hit a pregnant woman without even blinking. "Why don't you say something, you black bitch?" He stepped closer, leaning in close to her face. He smelled of sweat, cigarettes, and cheap alcohol. Disgusting. She looked up. Her eyes sparkled in the dim light of the lantern. "I'll remember you?" Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it that made even the other cop's face change nervously. "You black scumbag, you're not even trying to get in my way." Bang! Another blow, this time to the cheekbone. A sharp flash of pain tore through her consciousness, and Chiara collapsed to the ground, her palms smashing her knees into the rough asphalt. The policeman chuckled. "That's right, nigger bitch. Remember your place." Chiara was breathing hard, the blood in her mouth mixed with the metal of fear, but not for herself. She gingerly touched her stomach. "The baby?" "What? It hurts, huh?" The cop leaned over her, grabbing her hair, forcing her to lift her head. His pale eyes glittered with anticipation. "You have no idea what you've done." Chiara said it almost in a whisper, but every word was sharper than a knife. The policeman grimaced. "You know what's funny? If you was white, maybe I'd just arrest you. But you're a dirty nigger bitch, and I like to watch you squirm." He leaned in close to her ear. "Because people like you shouldn't be here." Chiara felt something shiver inside, but not fear, not pain, something else. He raised his hand again, preparing to strike again, but at this point, something in the air changed. It was as if the whole street held its breath. It was as if something invisible had enveloped the space around them. Chiara slowly turned her head, and a faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared on her lips. The policeman froze. "You? Why the fuck are you smiling?" But Chiara didn't answer. She just looked at him, and there was something in her gaze that made his throat suddenly dry. And then she began to rise. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from and whether you've had something similar in your life. Your thoughts and opinions are important. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. And now we continue. Darkness enveloped the alley, imbuing it with clammy fear and heavy foreboding. The muffled beats of her heart drowned out the sounds of the night, but Chiara heard everything, every breath she took, every step the massive cop took, every surge of pain spilling through her body. She wasn't supposed to go up. She should have stayed on the ground, broken, shattered, humiliated. She should have begged for mercy. But instead, she stood up, slowly, almost painfully, leaning her palms against the rough wall. Her knees shook, but her spine remained straight. Her head lifted, eyes as cold as a knife blade. The policeman frowned. "What are you, immortal bitch?" His hand came forward again, but this time Chiara didn't flinch. She didn't pull away, didn't clench her eyes in anticipation of pain. She looked straight into his eyes, and that look was so frighteningly calm that the cop, without realizing it himself, hesitated. "You... what the fuck?" But instead of answering, she smiled. Only now did he realize that the smile was not a taunt. It was a warning. "You don't even realize what you just did." Her voice was quiet, but it was strong. "I don't give a shit," he shouted, dismissing the doubt, but now there was anger mixed with anxiety in his voice. "You think you can do whatever you want?" Chiara continued, tilting her head slightly. The policeman snorted, his face contorted with contempt. "I know I can. You think anyone cares about you? Nobody's gonna believe you. You're just a nigger that shouldn't be on this street. You think I'm the first to do what I want to people like you?" He stepped forward, looming over her again, savoring his superiority. "You ain't nothing, you nigger whore, and your motherfucker inside you ain't nobody neither." Silence. His words hung in the air, heavy as red-hot lead. The other cop looked away, pulling his head into his shoulders. Even for him, this was too much. But Kiara was still standing, and something in her presence changed. She no longer looked broken. She didn't look defeated. The policeman suddenly felt a ridiculous, irritating uneasiness. "What was it you said? I don't understand what I did?" He smirked, trying to regain some sense of control. Kiara took a tiny step forward. There was no more than a palm's distance between them now. She did not avert her gaze. "You just sentenced yourself." The policeman froze. His breath hitched. Why did it become so hard to breathe? Why had her eyes become so deep, so bottomless? For a moment he thought something was moving behind her, something dark. The shadow of the lantern lengthened. The air became thicker, heavier, and in that moment he realized he had made a mistake, a big one. But it was too late. The policeman took a step back, though he himself didn't realize why. Something in the air changed. Not the pungent smell of urine in the alley, not the faint glow of a street lamp, not the wet asphalt beneath my feet. Number something else. Yara stood up again, slowly, as if she wasn't in pain anymore. It's like she hasn't been beaten, as if she wasn't trying to be humiliated. It was like everything that had just happened didn't matter. The policeman clenched his fists, trying to suppress the sudden anxiety. "I don't get it. Are you immortal?" He said it as aggressively as before, but now there was something new in his voice. "What is it? Fear? Number?" He couldn't be afraid of the black broad he just beat up. "I asked you a question, bitch." But Tiara didn't answer anything. She was just watching. Her eyes, they weren't human anymore. They no longer reflected pain or fear, just emptiness. The silence stretched, became viscous. Suddenly, it seemed to the policeman that the sounds of the city, distant sirens, the hum of cars, even the wind had disappeared. Only his own breathing could be heard, deaf, non-rhythmic. He tried to say something else, but the words stuck in his throat. She took a step forward. His body tensed. Why? He just held her by the hair. He just kicked her in the stomach. He just humiliated her like scum. Why is he now the one who feels small? Kiara slowly raised her hand. The policeman recoiled. Shit, what's wrong with him? Why is he even letting her move? You don't even realize what you just did. Her voice sounded quiet, but there was more power in that whisper than in his badge, his baton, his weapon. I'm asking you again. Are you... He fell silent. The words stuck, because he'd seen her eyes. There was something there, something he'd never met before. Not fear, not anger, not the pain, and cold, unrelenting justice. The policeman gulped. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who he had just hit. And that was his biggest mistake. Kiara stood in front of the mirror in her apartment, watching her own reflection. In the dim light, her face seemed alien. Her cheekbones were sharp, her lips pressed into a thin line. The hematoma on her cheek was beginning to darken, and blood was caked on her lip. But it didn't matter. She felt no pain, not in the way a normal person feels it, not now. Kiara gently placed her hand on her stomach. Warmth. Life. He couldn't take it back. He couldn't take away her dignity. He thought he'd taken her, thought he'd broken her, thought she'd remain a victim. but he didn't know who he was messing with. She straightened up, took a deep breath, and walked toward her desk. Phone. She sat down, folded her fingers in a lock, and dialed the number. Long beeps. 1, 2. Go ahead. A muffled voice came through the speaker. I need authorization. There was silence on the other end of the wire. Are you okay? Kiara grinned. Me? Yeah. She glanced at her reflection. But your people? I don't think so. Muffled breathing through the tube. What's wrong? She ran her tongue over her split lip, feeling the metallic taste. A policeman attacked me. Who? A cop from the 6th Precinct, big white blue eyes. Last name. He wouldn't tell me her name. The captain knew what that tone meant. Kiara didn't ask for help. She asked for a green light. Are you sure you want to go down this path? The captain's voice became lower, more tense. I'm already there. Silence again, and then, permission granted. She smiled. I want him to suffer. It's going to take time. There's no rush. She hung up. Now, finally, the game is on. And the policeman who thought he had her under his boot didn't know yet. He was already dead. Kiara stepped into the conference room, her footsteps quiet but sure. She didn't hurry, didn't look back, but every person in the room, even those who didn't know her personally, felt the space around her grow heavier, denser. It was as if the atmosphere itself was filled with an invisible force. The woman they might once have considered just another dark-skinned woman in the system was now more than a presence. She had become a symbol. It seemed that only a few days ago she had been just another victim. But now she stood before them like a judge, in the face of anyone who was willing to accuse her of weakness, of vulnerability. Her new role in the city's judicial system quickly became known. And with that knowledge came change. It became clear to many that Ciara was not just an abused woman, but someone who was actually capable of changing the rules of the game. At first, she was taken for a strange figure. Noticing her calmness, they saw her slightly more violent than usual in the measures she took as a judge. She did not follow her usual path. No, her decisions were of a kind that made everyone question her rightness. Not all of her colleagues in the court were happy to see her. With every step she took, with every word she spoke, they felt the foundations of their own power changing. Her presence was becoming a threat to a system so deeply entrenched that the very idea of a woman's power to decide fates in a matter of minutes was frightening. You have no right. One of the lawyers tried to interrupt her. He was white, with a dolefully coarse tone, contempt in his eyes. You don't deserve that chair. Who are you to judge us anyway? Kiara didn't even look at him. She only raised her wand for a sentence and said discreetly, Those who call for justice must be prepared to face it head-on. And you, like most of your colleagues, do not realize that justice is not something that can be bought with money or secured through connections. Her words were simple, but each word echoed through the hall. This wasn't just a punishment. It was an open challenge to the entire system, a system that was used to ignore the rights of the weak, to violate their dignity, to make victims out of them. But she wasn't just a woman anymore. She became someone who opened the eyes of those around her to the fact that power could be used differently. Not to oppress, but to restore balance. But the more Kiara acted, the more she was persecuted by those who were used to thinking their power was absolute. They tried to convince her that her place was just a role she shouldn't have. You don't deserve to be here because you're not like us. Her co-workers started whispering these words, but she heard every word. They were trying to discredit her, constantly reminding her of her past, of her origins. However, with each such lunge, they came no closer to her fall. Chiara grew even tighter. She was no longer just a woman. She was the embodiment of justice, and every time she made a decision, her gaze grew cold and determined. And at this moment, when these prosecutors and lawyers were trying to undermine her authority, she delivered a verdict that shocked everyone. Behind that decision was not just punishment, but a fight for the right to be heard. It was not just justice. It was a rebirth of the system. All those who used to consider her unworthy began to realize that this woman would fight for everyone who had once been humiliated, for everyone who had felt the inhumanity of the system, and the harder they tried to ignore her, the stronger she became. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you are listening to our stories from, and whether you had something similar in your life. Your opinions and experiences are very important to us. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next installments. And now we continue. It had been weeks since the day the policeman had punched her in the stomach. Chiara couldn't forget that moment, couldn't forget his face, his confidence in his impunity. But she knew there was no room for weakness now. She was ready for revenge, ready to fight not only for herself, but for everyone he had ever humiliated, who had ever suffered such cruelty. Chiara was using her new position to weaken his position. She was beginning to meddle in matters that would have been foreign to her before. She scrutinized the archives, following the policeman's every move, studying his career, his connections. Once in this role, she had access to information that could be used against him. But, despite her determination, she remained secretive. Her personal history, her experiences, her past, all of it remained in the shadows. She wasn't about to reveal her cards right away. Chiara knew the power was in her silence, in her invisibility. In the eyes of many, she remained just a woman a policeman had encountered that night on the street. He didn't know who he was dealing with, and that was her weapon. However, her actions as a judge began to attract attention. With every decision she made, with every verdict, her name became better known. She did not allow herself to be wrong. Her justice was clear, decisive, and ruthless. Everyone began to realize that this woman was not to be trifled with. Meanwhile, the policeman, not realizing what consequences he had set in motion, increasingly felt his power threatened. He continued to think of her as a mere person who could not interfere with his life, his career. But his confidence began to falter when suddenly he began to hear talk of her at the police station. He noticed how his co-workers, those who used to look at Chiara with disdain, now began to feel differently about her presence. "Are you defending her?" one of the policemen asked when he noticed his colleague avoiding cruel jokes about her. "Don't you get it? She's not just a judge. She's someone you don't want to mess with." He laughed, not yet realizing that he was someone he shouldn't have messed with. Chiara, without revealing her true intentions, was getting deeper and deeper into the system. She used her connections to undermine the cop's credibility, to make his life worse. It wasn't an instant hit. It was agonizing, hidden destruction. She sent complaints, initiated investigations, meddled in his affairs, making him feel as his career began to disintegrate, as his reputation, the only thing he relied on, began to crumble. But to him everything remained external. He continued to look at her as a woman who had once fallen into his hands. He didn't realize that behind it was more than a desire for revenge. It was a thirst for justice. "You forgot your place again, didn't you?" he said to her, looking down at her one day when he met her in the hallway. "You're worthless. You're just like the rest of them." Chiara looked into his eyes. Her gaze was icy, but there was fire in it. "I'm worth a lot more than you could ever realize," she said without raising her voice. That was all he needed to hear. When she walked past him, he didn't realize at that moment that he had lost. The night was especially quiet, and every step in the courthouse hallway sounded like the loud thud of a hammer hitting metal. Chiara stood at the door to her office, her fingers trembling with anticipation, but she remained calm. A plan was already constructed in her mind. She knew this moment had to come. For too long she had kept her cards hidden. For too long she had remained a shadow in the system. But it was time for an open confrontation. Today she was not just a judge. Today she was to be the one who would shatter everything the policeman thought immutable, who would pass judgment. She was to be the embodiment of justice for him and for all those who shared his prejudiced views. Chiara entered the courtroom with a majestic stride. Her robe fluttered like a dark storm cloud. Her eyes held what was not left of the weak woman who had once been humiliated by that policeman. Now the cold fire of vengeance and justice burned in those eyes. When she sat down in her chair, everything froze for a moment. All eyes were on her, and no one knew what would happen next. She watched everyone in the room, and for a moment it seemed to her that even the air in the room began to smell of tension. No one knew what was going to happen next, but she did. At that moment, the policeman, the one who was nothing more than a psychological attacker on her, was in another room, relying on his superiority, thinking that his position was still inviolable. He was sitting at his desk, talking to a few colleagues, when his gaze happened to fall on a poster hanging on the wall. Judge Ciara Larson. The name was familiar, but its meaning was still unclear to him. He just knew that she was more than just a random woman who had bumped into him that night. What he didn't realize, however, was that the name was now linked to cruel justice. When he entered the hall, her gaze was already on him. He felt something tighten in his chest, and her gaze was so consuming that he felt uneasy. He was, as always, sure of his superiority, but her calmness and the strength in her eyes he noticed at once. "Are you okay, officer?" Her voice sounded soft, but there was so much power in it that he didn't know what to say. He took a step forward, but his confidence quickly began to melt away. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, trying to regain control of the situation. He tried to smile mockingly, but something inside him, something in his stomach, was already clenching with uncertain fear. Chiara stood up. Her face was pale, but strongly confident. She took a step toward him and looked into his eyes. "Yes, I know who you are. You're the one who hit me." Her words came out with the precision of a gunshot. "And you're the one who thought you could get away with it. But now, Mr. Officer, you will not be dealing with a woman. You will be dealing with justice." He turned white as a sheet. His knees went weak, his throat constricted, and he finally realized that everything he had known about power, all his privileges, were now caving in. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Ciara stood before him, and there was more power in her gaze than he could ever imagine. Everything he'd done, everything he'd said, and the way he'd humiliated her, it was now becoming a cruel reality. "It's the end for you." Her voice was quiet, but it was inevitable. Every word echoed in his head, unrelenting. He tried to say something, but realized he couldn't change anything. The moment Ciara passed a sentence, the policeman realized that his world would no longer be the same. His actions, his racist views, his violence, all those years of impunity were now coming down on him like an avalanche. And, despite all his attempts to justify himself, he knew that he was now the victim. The policeman sat in the court corridor, his face pale, his hands trembling. He tried to keep his face straight, tried to appear confident, but his inner world crumbled with every step he took toward the courtroom. Every sound of footsteps echoed in his head. Every look he caught from others told him that his world would no longer be the same. When he was summoned, he stood up with difficulty. His legs felt like cotton, and he could barely keep himself on his feet. But he still hoped it was all some kind of dream. He was still trying to convince himself that everything could be turned back around, that he could get out of this, as he always had, with as little loss as possible. But it was all an illusion. When he walked into the courtroom and looked at the judge, his heart nearly jumped out of his chest. It was Ciara, the same woman, the woman he had once hit, humiliated, that he hadn't even thought about at that moment, the woman who stood before him, and now she owned his destiny. Ciara sat back in her seat, her face cold and determined. When she looked at him, he felt his strength leave him. He was in front of the one he had humiliated, who was now in the position of not only his judge, but the one who would bring him punishment. His body tensed and he took a step forward, but realized his legs didn't want to obey. He bit his lip, trying to maintain a modicum of pride. How could he have let this happen? How could he have thought her fate would end there, in that alley? Everything he'd thought was right in his life had now come crashing down. Ciara, without a word, merely pointed to the bench. It was a gentle but commanding motion. "Speak." Her voice sounded clear and steady, but there was a power lurking in it that he had no choice but to speak. He sat down, but he couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was looking at him like an animal caught in its own trap. The lawyers and prosecutors sitting nearby exchanged glances. Some of them, like most of the people in the room, didn't know the whole story. To them, the cop was just the accused, and she was the judge who enforced the law. But to him, it was more than that. His gaze slid over Ciara's face, and he suddenly realized that his racism and aggression would no longer go unnoticed. He was in front of the woman he'd once ridiculed people in front of, the woman he'd once thought he could do whatever he wanted. And now her eyes became his sentence. Ciara opened the case file and looked at him. There was no pity or annoyance in her eyes, just inevitability. "How are you feeling, officer?" she asked, and his own voice seemed distant and foreign to him. He couldn't collect his thoughts, and even the air around him seemed viscous and heavy. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. There were no excuses in his mind. He knew he could never justify his actions. Not to her, not to himself. His racism, his cruelty, everything he'd thought was normal now seemed disgusting and unforgivable. "You humiliated me. You humiliated me in front of everyone." Her words echoed through the room as she continued. "You thought my life was worthless. But today, you will see that feeling of emptiness return to you tenfold." The policeman glanced casually at her face, and in that moment he realized that he wasn't the only one who had witnessed the change. Everything had changed. She went on, giving him no opportunity to justify himself. Her sentence was few words, but every question she asked, every look she gave him shook his confidence. "Did you think you could continue to live in this world, treating other people as nothing?" Her gaze pierced through him. Now you have to see what it means to be nothing." The policeman could feel his face burning with shame, his body shrinking under the gaze of those who watched the proceedings. Every word Kiara said became his humiliation. He looked into her eyes and suddenly realized that he could never escape from this. The trial had reached its climax. The policeman sat in the dock, his face white with fear and humiliation, but he still couldn't let go of his conviction that all this was just a coincidence, a temporary redemption. What he didn't realize was that for Kiara, this wasn't revenge. This was justice being served. For her, this moment was not only a judgment on him, but a test of the entire system that allowed people like him to continue to live and do evil. But things weren't going his way. Kiara stood before him, her figure in the judge's chair as hard as stone, her eyes glittering with a coldness that penetrated her very soul. At this point, she was no longer just an abused woman. She became a symbol of the fight against racism, violence, and brutality that was part of everyday life for thousands of people suffering in the shadows. "Do you still think what happened was just a personal grudge?" Her voice was quiet, but it had more power than any shout. She didn't take her eyes off the policeman, who, despite his attempts to justify himself, couldn't meet hers. Kiara paused between words to make each statement she made sound like a sentence from which there was no retreat. "You think you hit me because I'm not dressed right or talking right? No, officer. You hit me because I was a woman, a black woman, and because you thought I didn't belong in this town, in this community." Her words crashed into his mind. He couldn't take his eyes off her. His chest felt cold and his throat felt tight. He realized that everything he'd once considered normal, his racism, his prejudice, his rudeness, had now been revealed to the world. The prosecutor addressed the court. "Your Honor, this man's crime goes beyond just assaulting a woman. He is part of a system that distorts the concept of justice on a daily basis. His violence is not just an accident, it is the result of a system that allows people like him to believe in impunity. This is a problem that will not go away until we start fighting it, not just in the courts, but in every corner of our society." Her words were like thunder. This wasn't just an indictment of one cop, it was an indictment of the system. Ciara stood up and walked past the accused without looking back, ignoring his pathetic attempts to justify himself, his suffering. He was just part of a larger tragedy that was much deeper than his actions. "You thought I was weak because I was a woman. You thought that my race and my gender meant that I couldn't stand up, that I couldn't respond. But today you will see that I, like all those you once humiliated, will not go down without a fight." Her voice sounded not like vengeance, but like a fate that was to come. She had passed judgment, and judgment was on her side. The policeman was found guilty. His career was destroyed, his life ruined. Everything he had done, all his confidence, everything he believed to be his strength, was now shattered by one action, one decision. Even so, Ciara knew that her fight was just beginning. His punishment was only part of a much bigger case, a case to destroy the system that gave people like him power and impunity. As he left the courtroom, his face was red with shame, and he could not lift his eyes. He knew that his life was now devalued. He was no longer who he thought he was before. He was nothing. And for Ciara, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The whole town knew her name now, but she wasn't looking for fame. She was looking for justice, and she kept walking. What do you think about this story? Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us. We appreciate each and every one of you, and your comments really help us to become better people. If you like the story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. We wish you a good day. Write the phrase, "Justice must be done," in the comments so we know you listened until the end.